Are there a lot of, I mean, have you come across a lot of Latinos in coding? I mean, I was covering a LULAC event the other day, and I was the only brown person in the room of all the journalists. It was weird. And I'm at a LULAC event, LULAC town hall.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a community of Black and brown folks here in Oakland that are getting into code. There's a spot called tequeria.org. They're doing online meetups, and then they do meetups all over Silicon Valley and in New York and stuff. So there's definitely a bit of a connection there, but it's hard. Yeah, the numbers just aren't what they need to be at all companies. Diversity is something that's super important. I'm one of the ERG leads, employee resource group leads at Dropbox, trying to build a community for Latinos at Dropbox and attract talent. And it's hard. The people either there's just the pipeline of getting, Black and brown folks who can code and do all this other stuff is either just dry and we don't know how to find it, or whenever they do get in the door, they don't have the right background or expertise or technological, whatever you have experience in certain areas. So it's hard to make a case to hire some folks sometimes.
Yeah.
But we're doing our best to try to make places as diverse as possible.
I mean, you're almost talking about affirmative action, and I've always gone back and forth my whole life on affirmative action, right? There's people, Sonia Sotomayor says, I would never got into Princeton without, she says that without affirmative action. So you're like, okay, that's a good thing. But then you want to hold Black and brown people to the same standard as whatever the highest standard is, because it's almost like a reverse racism. Like, we're going to lower you to this standard because you were poor, or you're there because of racism. But then you're like, no. And you see that with shows, right? You see that, there was a great, I don't know if you've seen Black as Fuck on Netflix. It's really good.
I started it. Yeah.
It's
a couple episodes.
Super good. And he talks about this, there's some Black movie out, and he's like, why am I the only person who thinks this sucks? Is everybody just applauding this because it's a Black movie, right? And I feel that way with my own Latino-ness, right?
Yeah.
That show or that performance. I'm like, it sucked. Why is everybody applauding it? Oh, I get that we don't have that much access, and that anything that a Latino does on the mainstream has to be applauded and encouraged. But again, when the quality is not as good, then you're stuck of applauding something that isn't as good as it could be.
I think that's always a challenge in terms of we typecast ourselves. And I know that I did, in the sense of this is my culture, and I want to be I want to recognize it, and I want to be recognized for it as well. That's a lot of what Gozamos was into, that we were always shoehorned as.
Is that an insecurity?
Yeah, right. We were always shoehorned into Latino arts and culture, but we covered so much other stuff. And we always wanted to be up there with New City and all these other organizations in terms of quality, but it's also it's a challenge to elevate it to that perspective. So it's tricky. There's
because you don't have for all the reasons that we covered, right? You don't have the funding. There's not the pipeline there's not a lot of kids doing art, coding, and whatever, as much as there is in the white community.
Specifically in tech, the problem is that all of these companies, Googles and Facebooks, they're primarily recruiting out of Stanford, MIT, all these big companies. And all of a sudden, what you don't realize is you are now dependent on what their pipeline looks like, of how many Black and brown folks actually got into MIT. And if you're just recruiting those top MIT folks, right?
It's a bottleneck into MIT. So imagine the flow out. It's more of a bottleneck.
So companies are just doing a disservice to themselves. There's some interesting stuff that's happening around what are called apprenticeships in the tech industry right now. I was a manager for a couple of them and really help folks, get access to it. But at the end of the day, these folks are just as talented as someone else that I would have hired that does come from one of those big schools. But it's just a matter of giving the opportunity to demonstrate that. The challenge with most companies, and especially tech companies, is that you have to prove that you 110% can do the job that I'm hiring you to do. And that's actually quite hard. How do you go to a company? How do you go to a Google and say, oh yeah, I absolutely have had this exact same type of experience. I've managed I've built scaled sites or whatever. It's really hard for people to have that experience in their belt to then go and apply at a company and then pass all the quizzes and whatever the hell else they have to do. Whereas if you just say, okay, I know you don't have that experience and that background, but you're clearly a sharp person. Let's get you in the door. Let's get you some training and the right mentorship, and all of a sudden people are excelling just as well as anybody else.